Rob Hirst, thank you for taking us through the Midnight Oil story for the Australian Music Vault. Given the experience on the road now, Rob, do you think there's a renewed hunger for music and politics?
So music and politics was always a tricky mix. There's a power of suggestion in your music which is stronger than laying out a series of bleak facts, which is a real turn-off. We always thought in Midnight Oil if we could get people dancing and singing big choruses with a really strong beat and loud guitars, with a big live show with lights and PA, then maybe by osmosis or as a secondary effect, people might actually listen to verse lyrics and understand what we were talking about. But the blunt approach, the hammer across the head was never going to work with any audience. Much better to use imagination and to come at those topics tangentially. And it was a question of who you wanted to be. Did you want to be a bunch of activists or would you want to be musicians? We started in a Chatswood garage in Sydney and we were budding musicians. It just so happened that the writers, mainly Jim and myself at that time, with Pete adding lyrics here and there and Martin helping with arrangements, it just so happened that our obsessions and our background tended towards what we thought were interesting issues here and overseas. In my own case, I'd come out of Sydney Uni being fascinated by the civil rights period in the United States and having read a fair bit of Eldridge Cleaver and Malcolm X. And so I sort of carried that, I suppose, into what I was writing with the band, songs like Powderworks and those songs on the first album. But I think even back then, instinctively, we knew we actually had to create some music which was powerful and could be put across live very strongly. And I think that was the right way around. I think activists becoming bands have had a pretty sorry history. And to this day, the jury's out with bands like The Clash and the U2 and others. I think possibly the bands that have had the greatest authenticity have been, in Australia, First Nation bands and Koori bands, because it's clear their background and what they've been through. And the lyrics are often very direct and very raw. And everyone can understand that, and it just can't be faked or fabricated.
What was your first live music experience as a teenager? The first band you saw?
When I was very young, I saw Johnny O'Keefe down at Balmoral recording for, must have been Sing 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 or Saturday Date or one of those shows of his. And he was sweating profusely and, miming like a true professional, and it was just great. And I was really quite amazed by what he was putting into this performance, and something must have twigged, and I thought, oh, okay, so to be a performer, it's a kind of a total thing. It's not something you do part-time. So, but the first really moving concert I ever saw was Led Zeppelin. I think it must have been 71 maybe, at the Randwick Racecourse. And they played for about 3 hours. I think more than an hour of that was John Bonham's drum solo. But it was just that point that I went back and saw music quite differently, the level that we actually had to achieve. Because they were a supergroup when the title wasn't corny. They were the best around, and it was just a mind-blowing and extraordinary and cathartic performance. And then we saw over the next couple of years, we saw other bands that came to town, including the Stones and Creedence and others. But yeah, that kind of raised the bar, Got to remember that Australia back then wasn't really connected to the rest of the world. You had to wait for bands to come in order to get a dose of what was really happening. The only way and for a young band, the only way it seemed like you could get to Europe or America was to win the Hoadley Battle of the Sounds, and get on a cruise ship. That would take 6 weeks. By the time you got there, the Beatles would have probably put out, Revolver or something, and you would have had to go back to the drawing board. But we're very remote, so we relied really much on going to those big concerts. But everything was taken in, and I remember storing all that away and thinking, yeah, this little band in Chatswood, we've got a bit of work to do.
Take us into the pubs of the mid to late 70s, perhaps time date it for us as well, and the sort of genesis days of the Oils, and how important it was to shaping the band and shaping the sound of the band and the attitude of the band, Rob.
So Midnight Oil was very fortunate because we actually came up at a time when people loved going to pubs and clubs, and back then they also bought vinyl and cassettes in large numbers, and also they were tribal in their loyalty to whichever band. And in those days the bands were, in no particular order, but of course AC/DC were a big influence. Skyhooks had just come in from Melbourne, big influence on Pete, I think, particularly, Shirley. And we all had our favourites before, including Loved Ones and Chain. But we arrived just after Angels and Cold Chisel and Rose Tattoo. And we were there roughly with Mentals as well, Dragon, My Sex, Jimmy and the Boys. So you can chart the history on posters, because that's what we used to do. We used to go and put up posters wherever we were before the internet age. And we would play on average 4 or 5 nights a week, initially downtown Sydney at places like French's and Checkers, Stage Door Tavern, the Rex Hotel in King's Cross. But then after that we would go to the Burbs, and we'd end up at the Coman Cutter at Blacktown, at the Family Inn at Rydalmere and Castle Hill RSL. You know, we'd go out where the actual people were. And we did this for about 3 or 4 years relentlessly. We weren't getting very much airplay except a little bit on Double J as it was at the time and Triple R in Melbourne. So those first years really and playing in the pubs and forcing radio's hand eventually. They didn't really want to play us, but kind of had to at the end because we were pulling such big houses. We weren't really putting on a pub show. We're more like increasingly putting a concert show on in pubs in front of, and when I say pubs, I don't mean a couple of hundred people. I mean 1,500, 2,000, 2,500 in these beer barns with massive PAs, big light shows, and a live act, which involved a lot of sweat from the singer and the drummer and people throwing themselves into the audience and young men stripped to the waist and a fair bit of beer and violence and it was, so as a result, the music reflected the places we were playing, which were pretty tough, pretty male, pretty young. And so if you listen to the early Midnight Oil albums, on the first album there's a couple of kind of prog ballads, but mostly it's guitar-driven music, and it had to be because we could see people glazing over. We used to write songs in order to get through those gigs. So they had to be tough, they had to be guitar-driven, they had to be loud. It was a kind of Lions and Christians thing, who would win. It's a bit like Mark Seymour's book, 13th Hun Theory. You bring in the biggest PA and it's quite gladiatorial. You're going to win or, so... And we did that. And the great thing was that not only was it a great songwriting tool, because we knew exactly which songs were connecting immediately, but it was a great... It was a great thing for a band to learn stagecraft. So by the time we went overseas, in the wake of AC/DC and other bands, we were a really tough band and really wouldn't be intimidated by anyone.
The Oils chant also became quite synonymous with an Oils gig before you came on stage. Talk us through those moments, I guess, before you came on stage and you could hear the Oils chant go up and what that felt like for you as you came out on stage in that sort of five against the world kind of attitude that was quite prevalent for the Oils at that time.
Our band, we had an amazingly devoted crowd, really tribal. And it was quite scary at times, to be honest. I felt really worried about some of the smaller people and women in the audience because it became so male, so testosterone-driven. It was strange, because in our music we were trying to put over some pretty clear ideas, some quite sophisticated ideas, but we did it with a sort of massive boot up the backside with this huge PA and clobbered people over the head with volume and lights and big show and smoke. And so I guess we were our own worst enemies in a way. It wasn't put subtly. I mean, but this was, this was a particular period in time in Australia, which I don't think will ever come back, where this is all people did. They went to see bands. They weren't distracted by their computers or their tablets or their iPhones or their devices. They weren't going to huge raves with DJs and dance music and hip hop or trance or jungle or whatever. It was rock, and it was a particularly strong and sometimes violent form of rock music. They weren't all rock bands. There were bands like the Dynamic Hypnotics and the Rock Melons that were playing more soul and funk, but they were in the minority. Most of the bands to survive played a really strong version of guitar rock music, and we were one of them. And so to go out and confront an audience that had already drunk a lot, midsummer they drank even more. It was more like going out and fighting a heavyweight championship boxing match, where you knew that you probably wouldn't go 15 rounds. Someone would be knocked out before then. We had crew that would regularly throw themselves into the crowd and gently escort people out. It wasn't for the faint-hearted. And I think early bass players like the Bear, Andrew James, and then later Peter Gifford, I think they felt the strain of this kind of touring, which was more an atavistic survival routine more than music. I mean, we tried to make it as musical as possible, but sometimes I think it was the uncontrollable Nuremberg rally-esque kind of aspect of the gig which distracted from the music and made it something altogether more uncontrollable.
Let's talk then about the political and social backdrop of the times, particularly late 70s, and the sorts of things that were informing your writing, particularly in terms of the lyrics for the band. It was kind of like an urban angst meets global foreboding.
So when I think back about the 80s, I think about a time when a lot of people were living in fear. Intercontinental ballistic missiles apparently were pointed at everyone. Russian premiers were threatening annihilation. There was a nuclear standoff. In Britain, Billy Bragg had formed the Red Wedge with people like Paul Weller, and they were trying to bring down the Thatcher government, which they didn't. She just got more votes every time. It seemed like you were banging your head against the wall. Maggie went to war, of course, in the Falklands. Chernobyl happened, a disastrous nuclear incident, which a big cloud went across Western Europe. We were there at the time. The so-called Troubles in Northern Ireland were still in force. We were staying at St John's Wood when the IRA blew up the bandstand and killed a whole lot of horses and musicians. It rattled the windows of where we were staying. Apartheid was in full swing in South Africa, and there were massive marches in the UK and elsewhere for Mandela, who appeared at those rallies. And whilst we weren't the only band that were carrying the mantle, there were a lot of other bands that were quite strongly political. Painters and Dockers come to mind, and I think we felt for a while that along with The Clash and U2 and other bands, we were one of those bands that just couldn't help, and with Billy Bragg, we were one of those bands that just couldn't help speaking out louder and louder, and it reached a point by 1984-85 that I think Pete's frustration boiled over with just being in a band, and then he wanted to make the next step and try to make serious changes with the formation of the new nuclear disarmament party, which was pretty much a one-issue party based on denuking the world, an ambitious project, and of course one that was sabotaged eventually on election day by the major parties swapping preferences and keeping Pete out. But he did extremely well. He got over 10% of the vote, which was huge. And basically a whole generation of school kids knew about the issue and spoke quite eloquently about it because of, A, what the band had been saying and about what Pete had been saying directly by going from school to school.
I'm going to just get you to go back to the late 70s though and tell me about those early influences for you and the band in terms of the politics of the time and what you wanted the band to do in terms of the shaping what the vision you had for Midnight Oil.
In the 70s, late 70s, we got a gig every Tuesday night at French's Wine Bar in Oxford Street in Sydney. Tuesday night was the night that Paul, the owner, could never fill, so he put this young band on from the Northern Beaches and we started to work our way up. Within weeks, actually, we pulled a crowd and we started to get some reviews from people like the late Andrew McMillan and Greg Taylor and others wrote about the band, and we started to make some kind of presence felt. One day we walked up the road and who should we see at the Oxford Funhouse but Radio Birdman? And they had an even wilder crowd. And they were playing music which was heavily influenced by the MC5, Detroit music. And it was louder and faster. Then they had a crowd that we wanted. We wanted that crowd. Because we were still playing a combination of the songs that Jim and I had written, early ones like Surfing of the Spoon and Powderworks, but we'd also were playing songs like Nothing Lost, Nothing Gained, which were from that kind of prog period, you know, influenced by Peter Gabriel and King Crimson, Yes, people like that, Jethro Tull even. We realised we had to harden up our sound. We wanted to be more like Birdman and the Hitmen and those bands. We wanted to be a more cohesive unit, and it changed us overnight. I remember also AC/DC changed us, because we did a gig supporting AC/DC at the Ride Youth Dance, and they were immensely loud, and Bon was at his cheekiest frontman best, and they were dirty, and when Bon played the bagpipes in A Long Way to the Top, it just kind of completely blew the roof off, and that was a game changer as well. So there was strong musical influence, but there was also this stuff that I was obsessed with, which was having read James Baldwin. I imagined a period in Australia's near history where the tragedy of the First Nations people would actually meet with the wealth of, you know, white European Australians, and there would be, back then I imagined there would be some kind of cataclysm. Not a treaty like in New Zealand, but more like a showdown. And so, you know, I was kind of starting to write that kind of stuff into songs like Powderworks and later on. But the more we travelled, the more we saw places that had been there where the environment had been compromised or destroyed. The more we saw, well, right outside the steps of French's, we saw people, a lot of homeless people were there. Gary Morris, our manager, was very keen on the band right from the word go to do benefits and to put them on ourselves alongside Jimmy and the Boys and My Sex and others. We're writing songs for the environment, but we're also doing gigs at the Town Hall and Paddington Town Hall, political rallies, more like it. And we were making it up as we went along. We were relying on the gut and the heart as much as the intellect, but I think the message was strong and the band was playing its arse off every night, and because we were really road hard by then. So it must have been quite a potent brew.
We're just going to go to Head Injuries and Stand in Line, Goodbye to the Let It Happen stand. In a political kind of context, what that song Stand in Line was all about and what the message of that song was all about?
So I remember the band as being really frustrated by everything, frustrated by not having a decent PA. We couldn't hear ourselves on stage. Frustrated by the monopoly of the agents in the industry and trying to work our way through that. Gary Morris, our manager, was making enemies all over the place, but also working incredibly hard to forge an independent path for the band. Stand in Line was a kind of a cry of frustration from the ranks that we still hadn't got to where we wanted. We were being ignored by the industry. The radio wouldn't play us very much. We were relying on our own devices, just building up a live crowd. Countdown wasn't even in the question. We weren't going to do Countdown. So we were in it for the long haul, but we were also frustrated that we were stuck in a certain place. So Stand in Line, I wrote the chorus with that frustration in mind, and then Jim wrote the two riffs around which the song is based. And Pete did one of the earliest kind of raps, you know, basically over the top of the riff, something he did later on a few occasions, including Power and Passion. We used to play it so fast, and that middle section became longer and longer. Jim would play these amazing solos over it. Pete would spit out the lyrics and run screaming around the stage with his shirt off. It must have been quite something to confront. And and so that was the band's frustration writ large. Something similarly that happened with Owner the Strong later on On a 10 to 1 album. You could tell the fact that the band was still frustrated musically, that we couldn't get the live show on record, either because of the producer or because of the studios we were using. And there was still this huge discrepancy between our recorded music and our live show. And we were making ends meet, but we were also continuing to go into debt because we didn't want to compromise the PA and the lights. And so it was like, you know, we're kind of trapped. We had to go on, otherwise we knew we'd be working the rest of our lives for the ANZ Bank in Chatswood to pay off a massive loan.
We're going to go to the fourth album, the breakthrough album, 10 to 1. The Americanisation of Australia, breakthrough single, Power and the Passion. So specifically around Power and the Passion and the backstory of the song and the significance of what the message was.
So we'd been to the UK in 1981 and we'd recorded with Glyn Johns, famous producer of The Who and the Stones and Zeppelin, and we'd made an album for an A&M, which they hated and we loved. We took it back to Australia. It got a little airplay, courtesy of the late George Wayne on Double J, Triple J, and a little bit of airplay, but didn't get to where we wanted to. Still a bit frustrated by the sounds on that album. And since then, by the way, Glyn Johns has apologised to the band that instead of recording that album at the Olympic, for example, in South London, we went down to his farm studio in Sussex. So there was a band that's still frustrated that we couldn't get our sound on an album. And then lo and behold, we met up the following year with someone that we'd met years ago in Melbourne, Nadia Anderson, who worked for Triple R. And she was managing a couple of artists in London, including M, famous for pop music, and also a young producer who'd grown up in Spain but was an Englishman, Nick Launay, who we met through Nadia, and he'd played us a couple of things he'd recorded with the Gang of Four and Nick Cave, and suddenly the light went on. And he said, "Look, there's this studio you should come and hear. It's the studio, it's called the Townhouse, it's in Goldhawk Road, West London. And there's a room there which got glass and stone, and Peter Gabriel's made an amazing album there, as have XTC and a few others. And it's got this huge drum sound, and I think I can get your sound, for the first time I can get the sound on record." So we went there and it was incredible. I mean, the sounds coming out of the studio sounded like they were way in front of the speakers. Instead of being way back there somewhere like our previous recorded stuff, it was right here. And Nick was just a crazy young producer with a million ideas. We were a band that was almost at breaking point. There were members leaving if things hadn't changed. It was a real make it or break it time. And we recorded a whole lot of material, and then came this song, Power and the Passion, which I'd written the chorus for, and the bridge, take what you get what you please. And I'd written the first couple of lines for the verse and a melody, people wasting away in paradise. And then I left it at that, and then say, Pete, you fill in the gaps over the top of the verse. And it was a classic example of joint midnight oil songwriting, where Jim once again made these wonderful riffs, interesting chorus chords. Peter Gifford, who was playing bass by then, played an amazing bass line. It's just extraordinary, particularly his jam at the end. We added brass at the end, which layered higher and higher. It was like this weird anthem. And I mean, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming because the whole thing's on a program, a sequence. It was a Linn drum, which was all the rage back then in the early 80s. And I was very suspicious of drum machines. But Nick convinced me that we should put the whole thing on a Linn drum, and then I could play live stuff over the top. We left a part in the middle of the song, which was originally going to be a guitar solo. Nick said, why don't you go and hit some things? So I set up all these drums and became that solo, which became a feature of that song and still is live. And it had all the Midnight Oil. It's weird because it had a dance beat, but it had all the Midnight Oil stuff as well. It had massive guitars, it had a riff, had a sing-along chorus, it had a kind of rappy verse. Interesting. A film clip was really good, courtesy of Ray Argyle and others. And I remember the engineer just jumping around the studio, jumping up and down the couch when we'd got the rough mix back. And I actually got a shiver down the spine as well. I thought, this is amazing. This is a band that's actually reinventing itself in the studio, kind of out of desperation. We just knew we couldn't stay in our pub rock kind of mode. And he was an engineer, producer, at his absolute peak, who had taken apart our music and was reassembling it in this ingenious way. And I just had a really good feeling about that song.
Diesel and Dust, 87. Give us a sense of the genesis of The Dead Heart as a single and the importance of it, what the message was and why that was so important to the band at the time.
So I suppose it was 84. We were in Glebe at the Midnight Oil office in Sydney, and we got a request via Gary by the folks that were making a documentary film about the handing back of what used to be referred to as Ayers Rock, of course Uluru, to the Anangu people who live around the rock. And they said, can you provide us with some music for this film? And we wrote back and said, well, why don't you contact Coloured Stone or Warumpi Band or Kev Carmody or Archie, and they said, no, we want you to contribute as well. They'll be there, but we want this film to reach folks in the cities, and by then we'd had a pretty good audience in the cities. So we provided 3 songs. One was an early version of Beds Are Burning with just my original chorus, but with different lyrics for the verse. They were only filled in after the Diesel and Dust tour. Another song was by Jim called You May Not Be Released, and which turned up later on. But the song we'd already completed was a song called The Dead Heart, which was originally recorded at Sony Studios downstairs as a demo. Once again, it was on a drum machine, but this time it was basically on 8s on the kick drum. I was fascinated by a conversation I'd had with Charlie McMahon, a didgeridoo player with Gondwanaland, and by the way, we hadn't been to the desert by this time, so I didn't know really what he was talking about until later when we went out there. But he talked about this rhythm that was set up by the axles on his Toyota troop carrier as he blasted across the Gun Barrel Highway towards Warburton, Laverton, those places, and how it would you'd get out of the car at the end of a long day of that and you'd still be vibrating. So I thought, well, that's a kind of a cool thing rhythmically. Why don't we put the whole song on that 8s on the kick drum and make it really loud? So that's the main propelling thing. And then there's a big, sounds like a big guitar thing, but it's actually Martin hitting a bass string through a fuzz box, which is that brrr in that song. So we took that and we took it to 301 Studios. Nick Launay was in town. And then we filled in the gaps. I'd already written the chorus. and the verses. So it was ready to go. I originally took it to Jim. It was much slower. Jim said, why don't we speed it up and put it on that eighths idea that you had. Jim added the do-do-do-do-do-do, which goes from a minor to a major, which is this lovely device which sort of sends a shiver up your spine, and which, by the way, has become a kind of a calling card now with our audience. Before and after the song, they keep singing it, which is great. And then, once again, we add brass at the end, a bit like Power and Passion. Jeremy Smith from Hunters and Glad Reed played trombone. John Ockwell played a counter cello line. Pete then added that little bit in the middle about uranium mining and pastoral companies. It was all put on a huge sampled snare, really loud. And the thing I love about the song still is this kind of, it's the brutality of the rhythm section, which just goes for about 6 minutes without stopping. But the melodies are quite sweet. And of course, Jim and Martin are playing acoustic guitars in that. So it's kind of an interesting device. If they'd played hard electrics, it would have kind of blown the whole thing out of the water. So to this day, it sounds really fresh to me. And it sounds like Midnight Oil. I think over the years, we've sort of gone into other people's territory. Sometimes we've played music which sounds a bit like The Who, sometimes a bit more like Beatles or other bands, a bit REM, perhaps even U2. But that song, I think, The Dead Heart, could have only come from us at a particular time. And the weird thing was, the whole thing was mixed and mastered before we even went to the desert. And there's one other thing about it that I was really concerned when we sent it off to the folks in the desert for the film. It's in the first person plural. So it's actually, for the first time, I thought it was stronger, the message was actually coming from First Nations people. But that was a huge leap because we hadn't gone out and met very many folks in the desert by then. And I was just keeping my fingers crossed that that message that we were giving was actually going to be their message. I mean, with all my reading with James Baldwin and the civil rights movement, I imagine it was going to touch a chord, but it wasn't until Gary Foley and others came in and said, actually, you've hit the nail on the head, and we got some kind of imprimatur from the people whose message it was that I actually kind of relaxed a bit with that song.
What was the lyrical intent around a song like Beds Are Burning?
So Beds Are Burning chorus, actually, I pinched from, blatant stole from an exhibition I went. Dennis Del Favero had, the artist Dennis Del Favero had an exhibition in Paddington. He has an Italian background, obviously, and the exhibition was about the fascists, Mussolini's fascists coming into the towns and the reaction of townspeople as the fascists took over. And that line, "How do we sleep while our beds are burning," I actually asked Dennis to, it was written in Italian, I asked him to translate it for me, and he said, well, that's what the partisans said. And so I took that and I coupled it with "How do we sleep while our beds are burning" dance. And I thought, well, that's exactly what has happened to First Nations people in Australia. We've well and truly burnt their beds. So I took that, and then that chorus was there for quite a while, just sat there. Once again, Jim came up with the verse riff and the da-da-da, because he said, well, we need something to wake people up. And, but it wasn't until travelling around the desert with Charlie McMahon in his old troop carrier that I filled in the verse lyrics. As we travelled around the Western Desert, I kind of added things that Charlie was saying, and through my wide eyes and through his incredibly wise eyes, I managed to fill in the gaps. And then Pete added the "Time Has Come" part when we got back to the studio, which makes the song even more urgent. Producer Warren Livesey suggested the falling down the stairs drum bit in the middle, which just happens before the last choruses. Once again, we used brass, which by then had become a signature, a little counter brass line at the end. It was Jim Magini that I think suggested the kind of weird sound effects, the birds that kind of come from left to right and right to left. And I remember Warren Livesey, when we finished the song, because remember, we didn't know that the song was actually going to be such a breakthrough here and overseas. It was just another song on the album. But I remember Warren Livesey coming to me and with a twinkle in his eye after the mix, and he said something like, "It's all right, isn't it?" You know, in that lovely understated English way of his. And I said, "Yeah, I think it is. I think it is." And the great thing about the song was, it now it seems like it was quite calculating device and single, but then it was just another song on an album that we wanted to be really cohesive. But the success of that song to this day opened up all the back catalogue and basically allowed us to go on and make all those other albums. It was amazing. I know it's a cliche, but it's amazing what a difference a single can make.
Blue Sky Mine, 1990, title track off that record, talking very specifically about the impact of mining. Talk us through the message of that song and why that was important for the band at that time.
So there's a book called Blue Murder, not to be confused with the Roger Rogerson Melbourne TV series, so famous, but it's called Blue Murder. It's by Ben Hills, I think, and it's about the impact of the blue asbestos that was mined for many years in Wittenoom, Western Australia, and the fact that a lot of Southern European labour had been brought out on contracts that they couldn't break to work in an entirely deadly situation. And so many of those men have since contracted asbestosis and mesothelioma, tragically. And they had nowhere to go. I mean, there is nowhere to go from Wittenoom, and they were on the other side of the world, and they were on contracts they couldn't break. And clearly the company knew what was happening, but they cavalierly went ahead and allowed this unfolding health disaster to happen, and we were very moved by it. And so the song, which was originally called Drought by Jim, was added to. I added the bridge part and the Who's Gonna Save Me part, like a bridge and a chorus to Jim's original lyric. I think Pete then, along with Jim, rewrote the verses, as he often used to flesh out the story. Warren Livesey, our producer, actually came up with that keyboard part in the beginning of the song, which sort of the nice, even to this day, people hear it and then they know it's that song. Pete added that harmonica intro part, which also is a great signifier. And it's an interesting song because it's kind of disjointed. There's a lot of parts of it, but and it was one of the last songs that we recorded for Blue Sky. We thought we were a little bit shy of songs of the calibre of the songs from Diesel. Beds Are Burning is a hard act to follow, as is Dead Heart and others. But when we'd finished it, we thought, oh, well, that might be a good song to kind of have as a lead track on the album. And of course, then the album became Blue Sky Mining as well, which was... and both those titles were, incidentally, I overheard, would you believe it, our accountant, Kurt Rendell, talking about companies. He came into Glebe one day and he was talking about companies that we shouldn't invest in, companies that had no prospects but that might just come up and go, and he referred to them as blue sky mining companies to be avoided. And so I took that and we used that as the title, and yeah.
Off the same album, Rob, the song Forgotten Years, you're a great student of history and observer of history, and it's threaded through lyrically the entire catalogue of the band. This one in particular was a really powerful song. Describe, just tell us what the message was of this song and why it was an important one for you to write.
So I come from a background, my family, quite a strong military background. I don't mean that my grandfather who fought in the First World War and my father who fought the Japanese in the Second World War were military people, but of course in those days you just signed up. That's what you did. And so talking to both my grandfather about his experience on the Western Front at Ypres and other places, and Dad about his time in Rabaul and Morotai and other parts of New Guinea, I got a real sense of what it must have been like for these young men taking off to war. And in Dad's case, he was there for 3.5 years. He was one of the last to come back after the war finished. My dad has just passed away, but he wouldn't really talk very much about the war. I learnt quite a bit about the regiment, though, and on occasions when he relaxed, he would talk about it. But what I did glean was from all of them was the horror of war, and it was something to be only used as a last resort, and the terrible casualties and the shocking effect on people's lives and the grief from which they never recover. And I tried to get all this into a song, and the song was strong. It was recorded beautifully once again by Warren Livesey. Pete does a very strong lyric. Obviously, he could relate to it as well with his family background, with his diggers. But more than that, I think, was the film clip that accompanied it, which was beautifully recorded by Claudia and Jane Castle at Verdun in eastern France. And we were so lucky to get that footage because it nearly didn't happen. The concierge waved us away, and Claudia Castle, in her imperfect French, convinced them that this was a really important message. So the choppers were brought in, the mist rolled in, became really atmospheric, and very strong message. And it's a song which to this day we've been ending our sets in Europe with it because it relates particularly to the European theatre, but also to the Pacific theatre, and still has a strong resonance, I think, with those that have had families involved in wartime, and a strong chorus and very Midnight Oil song, really.
Redneck Wonderland, 1998, title track off that album. Thematically, the commentary around that. What was the importance of writing a song about the rise of the right around Redneck?
So Redneck Wonderland is a gym song, and it was inspired because every night we were recording in Sing Sing Studios in Melbourne, and every night at about midnight or even later when we went home, we would pass this bit of graffiti next to the Yarra River, which had a map of Australia, and through it had Redneck Wonderland. And we'd been looking for a title, and of course there it was right in front of us. And remember, this is during the period of One Nation and the rise of Pauline Hanson, and it became a really angry album. Particularly when you consider the previous album, Breathe, had been so gentle and recorded in New Orleans and Sydney and had Emmylou Harris, and it was completely the opposite. It was this ferocious album where we kind of threw ourselves at it, particularly with some songs, including the title track, Redneck Wonderland. And so we recorded the original one. It's a Jim Magini song, and it was directed fair and square at One Nation and their supporters, and recorded initially by Magoo, and then Who Should Turn Up in Town, but Warren Livesey. So we did another version actually back in our old stomping ground in Trafalgar, where Warren added a whole lot of sequencing and beefed up the guitars with some rearrangement and became the beast that you hear now. And I thought it was one of the strongest songs we ever did. I was a little bit just quietly disappointed that it didn't actually grab people as much as we'd hoped to at the time. But now we've been starting the nights with it. It's obviously touched a chord now. Maybe we should re-release it.
The Stop the Drop concert at the Maya Music Bowl. Just give us a sense of the temper of those times, Rob. 1982, early 80s, the height of the spectre of the bomb, the role of the Stop the Drop concert as a call to action on the issue.
So back then in the early 80s, there was a terror about Russia, the Soviets going head-to-head with the West, and it was real. I mean, look back on it now and you think maybe it was overstated, but I don't think it was. As young people, we'd lived through we could actually remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 61, 62, and it's only now you realise how close JFK and Khrushchev came to actually annihilating it. So we remembered that. We thought, is this going to happen at the time? There was a theory called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, which was possibly the only thing that was holding the world back, because we knew that there were so many nukes out there that if someone pressed the button and inadvertently or otherwise, then there really wouldn't have been any of us left. So that was a chilling prospect, and So we were swept up in that, and we were writing songs about it, and it became quite an obsession by the band. So the Stop the Drop concert with other bands who were also interested in it must have been around about the time we must have just got back from the UK making 10 to 1. That was the band completely immersed back then in what we believed was possible end of days scenario.
In 1984, off the back of the Stop the Drop concert and the immersion of the band in that single issue around nuclear issues, nuclear disarmament, Pete ran as a Senate candidate for the Nuclear Disarmament Party and almost got elected. What did it say to you about the power of music in political activism?
So we always knew that no matter what we did as a little Australian band, it wasn't really going to change, the massive wheeling of the heavens as far as who was running the world. And I think increasingly Pete probably got frustrated by the fact that we always had to address things obliquely. Yes, we could do gigs, we could do Stop the Drops, we could write songs, we could do press, but I think it got to a point where Pete thought, actually, I can address this and actually change things if I become a senator. So this was something he passionately wanted to do. We understood the motivation. However, we were in the middle of making an album in Japan, Red Sails in the Sunset. Pete obviously had other things on his mind. We finished the album nonetheless and had some really strong songs on it. We were facing a situation where we were going to lose our lead singer should he become a senator. But for some reason, we didn't think that would impact on the band. We just thought, oh, well, being Pete, being the workaholic that he is, we would just manage to do both. We'd probably just organise the tours around the time that the Senate didn't sit, or something like that. And what would have happened to to that party? I don't know. Would the Socialist Workers' Party have got in and torn it apart? Would it have lasted very long as a single issue party? Probably not. It's hard to know. As it was, Pete didn't get in because of a conspiracy between the two major parties to keep him out, and then we went on to the whole desert phase of the band, and the rest is history.
The concerts that you were part of, Stop the Drop was really, I guess, one of the first major concerts for a cause that the Oils would go on to do many. There was the Wave Aid concert for the tsunami in Sydney. Why was that an important one for the Oils to reform?
So I think what happened, we got a call from Powderfinger saying, we've had this idea about putting on a big concert at Sydney Cricket Ground, and would you headline? Which was very kind of them. I mean, Powderfinger were a big band, they could have taken that spot. And we thought, yeah, we've got to do our bit. We'd broken up a few years earlier, or actually not technically broken up. Pete had left the band a few years earlier. But nonetheless, we really wanted to perform. The only thing was, which I wasn't sure of at the time, I only realised on the day, that Gary said there was a curfew at the end of the night. So everyone, of course, and these big gigs had played a bit longer. And so our hour had come down to about 40 minutes. Powderfinger also played over a little bit. They tell a hysterical story about dripping off stage, getting into the lift to come up to the dressing rooms, and just as the lift was closing, a very angry Gary Morris jumping in there with the band and John Watson and starting to tear them apart, and they didn't know who this guy was. It was just this sort of red-faced middle-aged man screaming at them. Anyway, I think Bernard said he was going to punch him or something, which probably wouldn't have been a good idea. But anyway, remember Powderfinger had invited us onto the show. So the problem was the minutes were ticking away and our gig was getting really, really short. And there was supposed to be a fireworks display at the end of it. And Gary kept on coming backstage going, I think he was virtually rolling around in the dust with Chuggy and whatever, defending the band, really. As it turned out, we got on and I guess we just broke the curfew and we played a bit longer. And it, from all reports, it blew the roof off. We weren't aware of it, but we had Colin Ellis doing our sound. He was our sound man for a long time, and I think Colin must know where the secret PA switch is, because people said, oh, the bands went through the afternoon, it was great, and then suddenly Midnight Oil came on, it was like, poof. So that was good to hear, and we played a pretty strong set, even though we hadn't played for a few years, I think. It was basically kind of a best of, and looking back on it earlier this year for the compilation videos that we've just put out, it looked pretty strong, even though we weren't really road hard at the time.
I'm going to ask you about the touring the desert, the Blackfella, Whitefella tour, and the importance of that. What sort of impact did that have on you as a band and individually in terms of the issues that you wanted to write about, that Blackfella, Whitefella tour with the Warumpis, and why it was so important to tour with them?
So the desert tour with Warumpis changed everything. Really changed everything. It changed everything musically. It changed our attitude towards our country. It expanded our knowledge exponentially about First Nations people and the history of the desert and our country. And we were shown places and given experiences that were very precious and unique. We saw amazing artworks. We met incredible people. We camped out under amazing stars. We saw terrible poverty and disease and alcohol and sniffing, and we saw the best and worst of the country all rolled into one. It made a huge impact on the band. We wouldn't have been able to make an album like Diesel and Dust had we not been there. It would have been just hearsay otherwise. We had great people out there coaching us through it, including Charlie McMahon and the late Andrew McMillan, who wrote the marvellous Strict Rules about the tour. Gary Morris was very strong and instrumental with the organising of it, along with the late Philip Toyne, who was director of the Central Land Council at the time. At the time, it was very hard, particularly the desert part. I personally found it incredibly moving, and I felt quite shattered by what I was seeing and the desolation of many of those settlements, the cold wind blowing through them. I still wonder what happened to those kids 30, 35 years later, how they fared. The Warumpi Band were the real stars of the desert. We were really their support band. And most of the time we just sort of absorbed all this and learned and listened and came back different people.
1988 was the bicentennial year in Australia, and music was a big part of the social and political commentary of the year. You were involved with the Building Bridges concert and album in that year. How important was the role of music and the role of the Oils, I guess, your own kind of role in that and telling the story of the bicentennial year?
So all in 1988, which was the bicentennial year in Australia, the band felt really uncomfortable about the way the celebrations were being conducted. We felt like First Nations people and their history and their tragedy was being trampled upon. We basically decided that we would leave. We didn't really want much part of it. We knew that it was going to happen anyway. We knew that it was going to be a recreation of Cook's Mighty Travels and there was going to be, the First Fleet was going to come in to mark the event of the actual Port Jackson landing. But it's not something we wanted to be involved with, and we just wanted to be somewhere else that year. We just increasingly thought this Whitefella celebration, we don't really want much to do with this. And that wasn't sour grapes. I mean, we understand what a marvellous, amazing country that's been forged, but we just didn't see what was in it for First Nations people. We just wanted to absent ourselves. And I think that's particularly because we had seen in the desert a couple of years earlier. It left us a profound impact. We thought, these city slickers, they don't get it. They can bring the flotilla in. They're virtually tramping on the grave of the people who were dispossessed, the people who were decimated by the diseases within years of settlement. And so we basically left and spent the entire year touring overseas on the back of that album.
You were involved in the Building Bridges concert.
We were, yeah. We came back briefly to play that gig down at Bondi. And but for most of the year, we just didn't seem to be in much of a mood for celebration. And, why are we celebrating this day? For most First Nations people, it was actually the beginning of, a shocking period whereby, brought nothing but bad news for Aboriginal people, And so there's still a long way to go on that. I'm personally of the camp that thinks that date should be changed, or if that's not going to be changed, then there should be a whole other date, a much more important date. I'm not sure what day that is, but celebrating the marvellous gifts of First Nations people to European Australians, which we don't do.
The idea to wear sorry suits at the Sydney Olympic Games ceremony and play Beds Are Burning, just give us a kind of a thumbnail sketch timeline on how that came about and how you were able to keep it a secret and what you were hoping to do with the suits and the song.
So with the Sydney Olympics closing ceremony in 2000, we'd been invited to provide a song. At that stage, we didn't know who else was going to be on and we didn't know which song. So we went out to the desert again and camped out near Papunya as a band so we could clear our heads and actually make a decision. And the band was quite divided and remained so. But by the end of 2 or 3 days at the riverbed with the cliffs and walking around and absorbing that marvellous desert energy, we decided that we would, because word came in that Yothu Yindi were going to perform Treaty, and we thought that we could use it to make a comment. Remember at that stage, the Australian government hadn't apologised to First Nations people about the stolen generation, and we thought this was a good time to make that point. There was a strong debate about the mixing of politics and sport and music, and we decided that we'd go ahead. And I think it must have been Gary that had the idea of putting sorry on the overalls. That was very much a Gary kind of idea. We got them made. We did a run through. We told only one person, David Atkins, who was the talent organiser for the closing ceremony, that we're going to do it. He said to us, okay, but we didn't have this discussion. We went ahead and organised it. We knew we actually had to wear coveralls over our overalls to the actual gig, because as soon as anyone actually saw what we were obviously going to do, they would have shut us down and they would have just, I don't know, cut to Crocodile Dundee or El Macpherson instead of us. They would have just cut us out of the whole ceremony. So we assembled downstairs. It was a bit like being, we could see out the tunnel, this massive crowd, we could see, it was like we were going out to Lions and Christians. It was like we were still debating whether we should do it. We peeled off our coveralls and we went and did it, and a huge roar went up, and John Howard's face went up on the screen, most displeased, and for that alone it was worth doing it. So,
at the closing ceremony of the Sydney Olympics that had seen Cathy Freeman win gold and a very strong First Nations presence through the Sydney Olympics, what's your recollection of the impact and power and significance of the performance of Treaty by Yothu Yindi at the closing ceremony of the Sydney Games?
I don't think Midnight Oil would have played Beds Are Burning or any other song at the Olympics had we not known that Yothu Yindi were going to perform Treaty. Because as a standalone song, protest, comment, it didn't really make sense for a band like ourselves to do it. But in conjunction with Yothu Yindi, who we toured with and who were friends, and we'd spent a lot of time on the road in Europe and the United States, that kind of made sense, because that was a linking of hands in a similar issue. So we got that. And that was one of the key reasons that we proceeded with it, because the band was very divided about performing at all at the Olympics. I was in the camp that we should do it, but mainly because perhaps I had more to do with it. I'd been producing a rather ill-fated album of, believe it or not, the athletes themselves performing and singing on this CD, and I'd been swept along by the thought that the Sydney Olympics could be absolutely something incredible and amazing, and of course they were. It was like the whole city was on Prozac for 17 days, and the weather was beautiful, and Kathy ran, and it was transcendent, and there were so many epiphanies, and I'm so glad that we were involved. And to cap it off then, in conjunction with Yothu Yindi and Treaty, and the effect that our song as well had on the crowd, and by the way, we were still debating it before we were let out, believe it or not, very midnight oil. We're still wondering whether this was the right thing to do as we slipped over off our coveralls to reveal the overalls with sorry written on it. We were still debating it, whether we should do it. But as soon as we were out there to perform the song, such was the roar that had gone up. Clearly, we were seen on the big screen and all around the world. It gave us such affirmation and courage to proceed with the song that it was, a 3-minute song felt like about a second. It was quite a moment. And I think it was the right thing to do.
Playing in those suits with sorry written on them and playing that song with such a big message, what did that mean for you on stage bashing out that song?
When we played Beds of Burning at the closing ceremony, the Olympics, we realised that we were going to reach a massive international audience and that probably most of the folks wouldn't understand the context or the message. But what we also didn't realise at the time was people like the French, for example, with their love of politics, immediately got the message and did a huge program around it. So in many ways, not just the Australians, but many of the Europeans and others around the world then applied that same message to their own Indigenous people. And I felt like we'd just kind of done our bit, that it was one of those moments. Many years had led up to it. And I felt, as did the band, I felt that we'd done the right thing, in spite of what the shock jocks said, that we should have stayed out of the politics of it. It was entirely appropriate. And after all, it was only a few years later when Kevin Rudd actually did make the apology. So to be part of that push for that to happen, we were proud of that.
1990 was the year of the Exxon protests on a flatbed truck outside Exxon HQ in New York City. In short, under a banner, Midnight Oil makes you dance, Exxon makes you sick. Where did the idea come from and how did you pull it off in the middle of New York City?
So we're travelling around America in the tour bus and we're reading every day about what had happened to Prince William Sound with this massive oil spill and how Exxon shares had actually gone up rather than down and how they were making light of it. And like most people there, we were just getting angrier and angrier that this massive oil company seemed to show no responsibility for the environment or the lives of the fisher people. And so along with Gary Morris, our manager, and Sony, we had a couple of people at Sony, Mason Munoz particularly, and with the assistance of the New York Police Department and Fire Department and every other department that you have to consult when you stop traffic at lunchtime in Manhattan, we planned this raid in between the two shows that we were doing at Radio City Music Hall. And the idea was that we would jump up on a flatbed truck with hire gear and we would play as many songs as we could before the traffic jam got too big and the cops shut us down. So what happened was, looked like it wasn't going to happen because the day before was very wet, so we weren't sure whether it was going to go ahead. I guess we came in from New Jersey or somewhere, we'd been playing. We did a run-through in one of the big warehouses down on the East River. Everyone had loan gear. It was all on a truck, and that was going to be wheeled into place right outside the Avenue of Americas and right in central Manhattan. And that's exactly what happened. It was sunny day, as it turned out. We played the show the night before. We slept in. William McGuinness, our tour manager, woke us up with the news that if we didn't grab our instruments and get down there straight away, that the cops were already going to shut it down because it had created already a huge traffic stopper, as they refer to it in Manhattan, and So a big crowd had already formed, so we walked there from the hotel. I remember Jim and Martin pushing through the crowd with their guitars already on, and we got there and the chief of police said to Gary, "You got one song." So we jumped on stage and we started playing. And then a strange thing happened. The cops started to relax, you know. It's like, "Hey, this guy's from Australia, the big bald guy, and they're all right." And so one song became two, became three, became four. By about song four, it was midday, and then another 100,000 people came streaming out of the skyscrapers, and our audience of, say, 5,000 became 50,000. And so for the last songs, we had this really huge crowd, and they got the message loud and clear. We had the big banner. Pete jumped up and then fell off the tower. We thought he'd hurt himself. We played songs, which were just recorded for the Blue Sky Mining, plus a few Diesel songs, a few songs that were well known, one from the EP, and then grabbed our instruments after about 6 or 7 songs and went back to the hotel and went back to bed. It's all done.
Job done.
And to this day, I'm not sure how we got away with it. It was only, I think, because of Gary sweet-talking the cop and the cops liking the music, and it was beautifully recorded, actually, the kind of mood of the thing on the King of the Mountain film clip.
The key issues for the band, there've been some consistent ones, and there've been some ones that have been more important at particular times. What are the issues that make you think I need to write about that, or we need to sing about that as a band, because that's who we are as Midnight Oil, and that's important to us in terms of our identity and what we're about?
We need to write about the changing of the Constitution for First Nations people so they're correctly recognised for their history and contribution. We need to contribute to the wealth of artists, musicians, playwrights and authors that talk about our disgraceful policy with refugees and recent immigrants from particularly Afghanistan, Iraq and other places that are war-torn. We need to continue talking about cleaning up the world's beaches to get plastic out of our thinking altogether, to change plastic to recyclables. We need to talk about moving from burning fossil fuels to the South Australian model of getting strong solar and battery power and changing to renewables, which is an avalanche which is happening. We need strong visionary leaders that don't care about their own necks but care about the country, who know instinctively and intellectually know which way we should be going and act upon it.
Why has it been important for you to write so passionately as a band, but as a lyricist in the band, songwriter in the band? Why has it been so important for Midnight Oil to have such a strong Australian voice around politics and social change through the music?
You see, I grew up with bands and musicians that really moved me, and they did it from a very early age, you know. I heard the Supremes perform Love Child when I was really young, and that opened my eyes to what happens in ghettos in America. I just didn't know. I grew up with Bob Dylan and John Lennon and John Fogerty and people that wrote, you know, songs which really moved me. And I thought if ever I had an opportunity in a band, I'd do my bit as well, because for me, songs are strong, but they're never stronger than when you actually combine them with something which is really a message, hopefully beautifully put and poetically put and often tangentially put, but something that people can relate to and interpret and binds people together in this extraordinary kind of artistic and musical and political companionship, and it's so strong when that happens. I wanted to be part of that. And along with a great songwriter like Jim Magini, who's the band's musical heart, I was so lucky to find a songwriting partner and musical force that we could drive that side of Midnight Oil, you know, the musical side.
In the song One Country, the opening line is "Who wants to change the world?" And generations of people have learned about issues, political issues, social movements and the like through your songs. Do you think music has the power to change the way people think?
So the combination of music and politics can be fraught. And it's received on so many different levels. Sometimes it's received clearly and matter-of-factly. Sometimes it's received subconsciously, with a lot of our audience probably unconsciously as they lie on the floor. I just think we can't be prescriptive about that. We don't know. We're absolutely certain that no matter how much Springsteen tried to get George Bush Jr. out for his second term, it didn't work. We know that Billy Bragg and the Red Wedge couldn't dislodge Thatcher. We know that music is fragile and only appeals to a certain number of people. Only a certain number of people get it. Only a certain number of people like it. People don't like to be bludgeoned often with politics with their music. They like it as an escape, not something that's confronting. You can only be true to yourself and just carve out your own little niche and do your own little bit. And if some people get it and respond to it, then that's fine, and other people don't. I don't think it can be anything more than just part of massive change. As we said before, the wheeling of the heavens, it's such a massive thing, and, you know, the Western world is only a small part of that. We haven't even spoken about, you know, the massive inequality in the world, what's happening in Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, India still, and South America. It's much bigger than we think it is, and it's all we can do to try to do as much as we can with our own little backyard and try to make that as good as it can be. That's all you can do.
The Oils were always very much about doing it on your terms. It was a take no prisoners kind of approach to the band, the five against the world, as I mentioned. Why was it so important for you to have set out on this road of Midnight Oil and be absolutely uncompromising in your politics, in how you went about it, where you'd play and who you'd play to, and the things that you wanted to sing about, and do it absolutely on your terms with that integrity?
We grew up amongst the ashes of all these fantastic bands that we'd loved, and through no fault of their own, usually management, but other reasons, they'd fallen apart before their time. Great musicians. I mean, Australians have always had this wealth in the arts, but particularly in music, I think. Great bands, great players, and so many tragic stories. It's just shocking, you know. And so when we were started, we knew what had happened to the Easy Beats, you know, we knew what had happened to so many bands that we loved, and we were just determined that we weren't going to follow the mistakes. So we were a bloody-minded bunch of bastards with a pit bull manager, and we were determined just to barge through, and it was kind of brutal and uncompromising, but it was a survival thing, and it worked. And we actually got to a situation where we could call the shots, which was, you know, for a brash young Sydney band that was unknown in the early days was something, you know. But we had things going for us. We were there at the right time. We were there at a time when there was a thirst for strong music. We were there at a time where people actually, you know, wanted to come to gigs and were happily paid $30 for a CD and cassette, and that, you know, that sustained us for all that early period. We wouldn't have got through.
Rob Hirst, thank you for sharing the Midnight Oil story. Thank you for the joy and passion and education and the dancing that you've given so many of us over so many years. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.